Good afternoon. Each year in the festival we have the Grimond Lecture, which marks the tradition of Joe and Laura Grimond in opening up fresh ideas and putting them into practice. So each year we look for an idea that is important for Orkney and an idea that is also important for elsewhere. Today we'll hear a story about how a community can take on a project and do it so well that it reaches the very top in its field. And by doing so, gives the whole community a lift. It's the story of the Isle of Sanday Knitters. Each year when we choose the Grimond Lecture, we contact the Grimond family and give them a choice. And this year, Johnny Grimond wrote back to tell us that he had chosen this particular one, and he said that both his father and his mother were very fond of Sanday, and that was one reason for choosing this. He also mentioned how his mother was interested in economic development, how she tried at one stage to get a company established in Sanday to bring tourists to the island. And he went on to say, "As for my father and North Isles knitwear, some of his most prized possessions were some beautiful socks knitted for him by Mrs. Tulloch of Cruisebreck in North Ronaldsay. They're now in the Orkney Museum." So the combination of Sanday, economic development and knitwear made this the number one choice from the Grimond family. The speakers are particularly suited to this subject. Sandra Towrie was born and brought up in Shetland in a family of knitters. She trained as a teacher. She worked in the Sanday school. Sandra became involved with the Isle of Sanday Knitters soon after the company was formed. She did just about everything in the years that followed. She designed, she marketed knitwear, she became a board member, became chair of the company. And now, of course, she has written a book with putting the story on record. Tom Rendall grew up in Sanday on the family farm. He studied in the evenings. He subsequently took Open University degrees and then a PhD for a thesis about Orkney dialect. Tom lectures at UHI Orkney, is custodian at the Orkney Museum and St Magnus Cathedral, and Tom is well placed to join Sandra in this story because he was for a number of years company secretary for the Isle of Sanday Knitters. So two people who are ideally placed to the story, and oh, what a fascinating story it is.
Right. Thank you for your applause. Hope it's not too soon to give applause. And so we enjoy what you hear. Anyway, I've been involved with the Sanday Knitters over the years as well. And I'll just hope that all this works. But what we're going to do today is look firstly at how the Sanday Knitters actually started. How the company was formed, the early years and expansion of the company, and then the duties of the company secretary and treasurer. That was me, but more of that in a wee while. We'll be looking at the patterns and designs and the actual knitting, which wasn't me. I didn't know knitting at all. Anyway, then I'm going to show you a few excerpts from the minutes book. I had to do the minutes for 12 years, and that was an experience in itself. It was helpful when I was writing my thesis, I can tell you that. Trade fairs and travels abroad, that'll be covered as well. And, of course, the final years of the Isle of Sanday Knitters. And we'll end up, Sandra and myself, on what impact it had on our lives. So I'm going to hand you over now to my former colleague and friend, Sandra Towrie.
Hello. As Howie said, I'm a Shetlander, born and brought up in Shetland in a family of women who all knitted. Everybody knitted in Shetland. If a woman ever sat down for 2 minutes without picking up her knitting needles, she was looked on as idle and a bit feckless. So, and I don't actually remember being taught to knit. I probably could knit before I went to school, and it was probably my granny that taught me, but certainly it was my mother that developed my knitting as time went on, because she was a very skilled knitter as well. So, how did I fetch up in Sanday? Well, I went away, trained to be a teacher, met a lovely young man from Sanday, got married to him, and arrived in Sanday. And this is how we came back after the wedding, on the old Orcadia into Kettletoft Pier. The Orcadia was the link to the outside world for many years. And before I start telling you about Sanday Knitters, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about life in Sanday back in the very early 1970s. It was so different from what it is today. The Orcadia came 3 times a week. We really only got fresh food once a week. And you couldn't do a day trip to Kirkwall. Only twice in the year, on the Legion Trip Day and County Show Day, could you have a day in Kirkwall. And oh boy, did we shop on those days. Otherwise, fresh food came on a Wednesday, and if you needed clothes, other than oilskins and rubber boots, the local shops had a good range of them. Any other clothes, it was the catalogues and the big, thick club book from which you could buy absolutely everything. There was more employment for young people. The main employment in the island when I arrived would have been farming and fishing, and there were teaching jobs. And I was quite lucky to get a teaching job shortly after I arrived. I arrived completely jobless, but I did some farm work and then got a teaching job. One of the things that affected Sanday then was there were very few jobs for women. The women weren't idle. They were all out there doing things, working on the farm, being unpaid carers, as they're called now, for elderly relatives and so on. But they rarely could find work that actually gave them some money, because working on the farm, as anyone in a farming community knows, the farm profits don't get translated into new dresses or fancy furniture. It's usually a new tractor or a better class of bull. So women didn't have a lot of ready cash to spend on themselves. As I say, I became a teacher in the school. And that's when I met Mr. and Mrs. Baker. Ron was the head teacher. He'd come to Sanday probably for a quiet job before he drifted into retirement. And I'm not sure what his wife Mary planned to do, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't to start a knitwear company. You couldn't do exams at the Sanday School at that point, so if you were at all academically inclined, off you went to the hostel when you were 14. And you could stay at Sanday until you finished your career, and then, or you could go on to university or whatever. And the tendency was that quite a lot of the boys stayed, and of those that went, some came back, but not very many. The girls that left to go to the grammar school rarely came back because they'd got qualifications to have a job of some sort, and that kind of job wasn't in Sanday. So, how did Sanday Knitters start? Well, Mrs. Baker somehow or another came across a copy of the Pins and Needles magazine one day. And at the back, there was a small advert asking outworkers to crochet squares. And she saw this advert, and she knew that a lot of the women knew how to knit and crochet. And she thought she would get them together and see if they could apply to this company and see if they could do some crochet. So that's exactly what she did. And there was about between a dozen and 20 women whose names are listed that did crochet. And it included somebody who's quite a bit younger than me, and she must have only been about 11 at the time, and she told me a couple of years ago that, oh yes, I remember crocheting those squares, and we got 6p a square. That was in old money, so 2.5p. But several thousand squares went from Sanday in various bundles, and if you look at the waistcoat on the left of the screen, that was the kind of thing that they were turned into, as well as bedspreads, bags, and everything else. But that kind of came to an end, and, you know, the women had had a few pennies. It wasn't very much, but it probably helped with something. And so they put their heads together and thought, well, we can all knit. Let's see what we can do. So Mrs. Baker got them organised, and they did some hand-knitted garments, and the sweater on the right of the picture there is one of the very first ones that they made. I managed to buy it off an online vintage clothing shop recently. I saw it and I thought, I've got to have that. It was a pain in the neck to knit it, and even worse to put the fringes on. But that was one of the earliest ones. And there would have been Norwegian, sort of Icelandic-inspired jumpers as well. At the same time in the island, the Shetland knitwear industry was booming, and there were 3 women in the island who had got themselves knitting machines, and they were doing some outwork for Shetland companies. And Mrs. Baker got her eyes on them and invited them to submit a garment each for her to market along with the other hand-knitted garments. So once they had this collection put together, it was displayed in the windows of the Kettletoft stores so that the whole island can see it. Because from the very beginning to the very end, it was very important to the whole community what was going on. Even if you didn't knit, people were tremendously proud of the company. So, how to get people to buy these jumpers? Well, Mrs. Baker was pretty bold, and she put the lot in a suitcase, went to Glasgow, got herself an interview with Sir Hugh Fraser from the House of Fraser, and allegedly tipped her suitcase onto his desk and said, "Can you sell these?" And he said yes. And so Sanday Knitters started. It was the Sanday Knitters Association to begin with. And up until then, everything that to do with the company had been stored in a cupboard underneath Mrs. Baker's stairs. But they were kind of running out of room, so they were able to, I was going to say rent, but I think they got it for free, an old church hall, and you can see it there in the middle of the picture, and you can tell that one of its previous lives was as a church of some sort. It was also had been used for a drill hall for the Territorial Army and the Home Guard in World War II. I'm not quite sure what the occasion was there, because as you will know, there were no mobile phones then, and so people weren't taking photographs of everything all the time. But that must have been an occasion of some sort, because there they were and they had their photographs taken. So when people were doing their knitting, they were always paid in cash, little brown envelopes with the money in. And whether Mrs. Baker did that for convenience or was it by design to make sure that the money went into the pocket of the person who had earned it. And so for the first time, a lot of women had a little bit of spending money of their own. Younger women like me with small children, it went straight into the purse and used to pay the dinner money or buy extra treats or whatever. But some of the older women saved up those envelopes of money. They just went in a drawer and were saved up for various things. including putting a new bathroom in a house. So it was all getting going, and business was booming. An organisation called the Highlands and Islands Development Board was getting underway, helping rural communities. Part of their function was to stop depopulation, and the way that they did this was to look at communities, look at the kind of work or traditional skills that they had in the communities, and help people to develop them so that they could make money from them and stay in their community. And Mrs. Baker, or I presume it was Mrs. Baker, got in touch with the HIDB, and to cut a long story short, they came on board, supported the company. It became Isle of Sanday Knitters, brackets Orkney Limited, and it became a limited company. And after that, the HIDB supported the company to go to trade fairs and with business advice and all sorts of things. So it was all going swimmingly. But by this time, Ron Baker had retired, and they kept going for a few years after his retirement, but their plan had always been to move back to be nearer their family. And the day came that they announced that they were going to move back. And there was quite a bit of consternation because everybody thought, oh Lord, what's going to happen to the knitters now? But the people who had been assisting Mrs. Baker in everything, and there was a number of them, just said, yeah, we'll keep it going. So one of the ladies who ran a post office as well agreed to be the manager, and the Bakers had a protégé in mind to be the treasurer and secretary. Tom's going to tell you about that.
Yes, I'm going to tell you how I was headhunted, if you must. I remember some sort of interview with the ladies at the Wool Hall, but that's another story for another day. But you can imagine at the time that Ron Baker left, I was a mere 27-year-old, yeah. A young guy, and all of a sudden being offered a job working with at least about a dozen ladies. A bachelor, of course, I was at the time. So I thought, this is going to be a wee bit daunting, but I got the job, and I stayed in it for 12 years. So the main duties of the treasurer and company secretary was really to look at, well, to record all the financial transactions. I should probably have... That's better. Yeah. So record all the financial transactions, send off invoices and pay bills, and prepare the wages, etc. Report monthly to the board of directors and take minutes, and ensure that all the documentation for the export parcels was in order. Right, so I'm not going to spend too long and bore you with any figures or any balance sheets because, well, we didn't actually keep any sort of records that we could show on the screen in those days. But payouts was an event every month because, as Sandra said, everybody got paid in cash. And you can imagine, I don't know how many ladies, probably about maybe 30 or 40 people to pay. Everybody had to get the exact money to the last 2 pence. So you can imagine trying to work out a payout, and the bank wanted me to have an exact amount of money to turn out of the bank when it came to Sandy, of course. So it certainly led me how to count money. I've never stopped since, I suppose. But yeah, the payouts was an event in the Wool Hall every month. So I went up there with the wee envelopes, and everybody came up and got their money. And some of the payouts was very little. I mean, some people, I'll not mention any names, but an elderly lady who certainly knitted into her 90s, Sandra, Just did a low-piece sweater just for the sheer fun of doing it. Maybe that was about £6 or £7 that she had been paid. So that was the payouts. The export orders was another thing, because of course, by the time that I took over as treasurer, we had to send, goods all over the world, literally, including to Japan. The reason I'm going to mention Japan especially is that, believe it or not, a man from Yokohama, I can't remember the name, doesn't it? Sumo, I think. Anyway, came to Sanday along with a designer, looked at our garments and ordered several sweaters, a lot of sweaters in fact. But it's one thing to knit them in Sanday, it's another thing to get them to Japan. So you can imagine having to do all the paperwork. That was before the days of any internet or anything. So a lot of I think I remember once going up to Lady Post Office and actually having to phone Japan. So that's why I can talk to anybody all over the world now. I think good practice. Having said that, we managed to get a sizable order. We had to be paid by letter of credit, which was a rigmarole in itself, as I say, before the days of the internet and so on. But we had a very successful sort of trade deal with them. But we certainly did orders to the US and different parts of Europe as well. And the other thing I did, of course, was it wasn't only bookkeeping. They needed a young, fit guy for doing the parcels. And the next slide, we'll just let you see what I mean about that. I honed up my making up parcel skills. It was very useful when my mother had to do the Christmas presents, because I was the star and maker up of parcels. Brown tape and strapping machine. I spent years of my life making sure that there were plenty of brown tape, but then I didn't tie up parcels. I couldn't be doing with that. We managed to get a strapping machine, that sort of black plastic strapping, and that was a huge boon for the parcels. I mentioned documentation there, so I won't go into that. But I was very lucky with the post office, because Sandra mentioned the manager who took over, and she was Barbara Sinclair. The Lady Post Office was literally a minute or two's walk from the wool hall in Lady Village. And I'm just going to think that Sandra and I had to work late one night, and I think, Sandra, do you remember, I nearly lost my way on the road from the wool hall to the post office to try and get the parcels posted the next day. Most of the packages of those days was sent by Royal Mail. And there is an example of the wool hall. You saw the Emmanuel God Be With Us, which is up at the end of the building. But there is the boxes piled up in the wool hall. And you see the pile of jerseys. I'm told not to turn around, but you see on the slide the pile of sweaters there being checked by the different people that was working there. You can see me on the left of the screen, just peering there. I wasn't obviously getting involved with the knitwear, but I had to get these boxes down to make sure that the goods went away. And I have there, it was certainly a random stack of cardboard boxes and staff checking all the sweaters. In fact, I do see Mrs. Baker in that picture as well. She's just hiding there doing some work as well. So that was my wool hall days. I will show you excerpts for the minutes later, but I'm going to hand you back to Sandra now to speak about knitwear.
Yes, that was a typical night in the wool hall. Piles of sweaters, people with glasses on the point of their noses. I didn't need glasses back then. Examining all the jumpers, sewing on labels, and so on. So, what were the designs like? The ones that Tom must have sent thousands of is the one on the left, the traditional Lopi Icelandic sweater. And I know that more than one of our knitters knitted into the hundreds of that design. I remember one lady coming in one night and dumping down her pile of jumpers and saying, right, that's me past 100 that I've knitted now. So we did those, and the machine knitters were doing sort of traditional feral yoke kind of jumpers, that sort of thing. But if we were going to, knitwear was booming, so if you were going to sell more knitwear, you had to come up with a different idea. And being isolated on a remote island, really the only sources of inspiration were the club books, magazines, and when I started being able to go to trade fairs, nipping around and seeing what other people were doing and picking up ideas, we could do something like that. So one of the things that came to me, the main trade fair we went to was in Aviemore, and the scenery around there is beautiful. And I had the idea that we could do sweaters with pictures on the front. They were appearing in the catalogues and magazines, but with motifs, horses' heads, all kinds of things. But I thought, why can't we do some scenery? And I started off doing jumpers for adults, but sadly don't have any photos of them. But later on, we also did some for children. And you will notice that that is my PD boy there, wearing the jumper with Start Point Lighthouse on it. And these were popular, they sold well. In fact, they were so popular that one time wandering around at Aviemore, I spotted on another knitwear stall an absolutely identical picture sweater to the ones that we were doing. Didn't say a word. Imitation is, you know, flattery. So, at about this time, we took on a firm of agents in London, knitwear agents, to help market the knitwear, because you couldn't be going to trade fairs all the time. They had the contacts, and some of their clients quite liked picture sweaters. And so we ended up having to do quite a lot of things that I probably wouldn't have chosen to do. That is me wearing the teddy bear sweater. It's not something I would have chosen to wear, but obviously adults did wear them because we knitted a few. And as for the skulls and crossbones, there were things every bit as bad as that, as well as flags of many nations. It all became a bit soul-destroying. At about this time as well, going to trade fairs, I was slightly headhunted by the HIDB, who offered me a scholarship to study knitwear design at no less than the Royal College of Art in London. And so off I went to London, and there's no time to tell you the stories from London at the moment. There's a few in the book, so you can read about them later. But that certainly helped me to develop ideas and be a bit different, perhaps. And I even went the slide on the left-hand side of it, were some of the garments that I developed while I was there, and the one in the middle, the one that's sort of black and pink, was actually, I designed the motif, but it was for knitting on the knitting machines, as were the garments that the two little girls are wearing. I, by this time, was doing most of the designing for the hand knitters, although if people had a good idea, because we were an equal opportunity kind of organisation, anybody could submit an idea, have it knitted up, and it would go to a trade fair. But the machine knitters were also developing their own styles. They had started off with basic machines that could do plain knitting, but anything fancy like a feral yoke had to be hand knitted. but they invested in more complicated machines that could do two-colour knitting. And so they were able to do the children's sweaters with motifs on them, and also the black and white tweed-looking sweaters as well. And it was some of that knitting that got us an order to Harrods. I don't remember how many sweaters we sold, but it was quite a bit of kudos to be supplying Harrods. Sadly, Harrods sent their own labels and their own bags with their logos on it, so the posh people who bought the jumpers that were knitted in this tiny island had no idea and probably didn't care where they were knitted. But we knew that we had sent jumpers to Harrods. Going to trade fairs with quite a large range of knitwear meant that we needed something for a buyer to take away with them so that when they got home they would think, oh yes, I saw those jumpers at Sanday Knitters. There was no money, and there was the jumpers were never ready in time anyway to get a proper printed price list, and we couldn't have afforded that. So at some point during all this, I had earned some money and had bought myself a portable typewriter, because before that everything was hand knitted. So I would type up the price lists and illustrate them. It's quite embarrassing looking at them because I cannot draw for peanuts, but you wouldn't believe how many hours with my tongue poked out with a pencil drawing all these little jumpers, and then once I was reasonably happy with them, I would get going with a little fine felt pen and mark them all in. And then on the other, the new piece of equipment that Sanday Knitters had managed to buy, a photocopier, we could churn out all these pictures, and we could also churn out patterns. In the run-up to trade fairs, it was really busy. I was doing most of the designing, and once I had an idea, the only way I could do it at that time was to sit down and knit the jumper and make notes as I knitted, and then convert that into a pattern for the different sizes. The Aviemore Trade Fair was in October each year, so this summer was really busy knitting, and I had little children at home, and sometimes it was quite difficult. You would sit down, pick up your knitting, and suddenly a toddler was draped round your shoulders, the middle child. And I did sometimes take refuge on top of the table. At other times, if it was a lovely day, we would go to the nearby beach and I would sit on a stone with my knitting, trying to keep it out of the sand and keeping a wary eye for the middle child, lest she tried to drown herself, which she was quite prone to doing. But one way or another, we got the collection together, got it packed up. I don't remember packing it. Tom must have done that. And it got sent off to the trade fair. And that's 1986, when I was there with Elspeth Sinclair, who was the manager by then. I've said that Sanday Knitters all along was a community event. We met every second Wednesday night in what had become called the Wool Hall by then. And people were, you know, the knitters came with their knitting, and the people who worked there, I say worked there, they did get paid pennies rather than pounds for checking knitwear and all the work they did. They got paid a tiny amount. But members of the public, and especially in the summer, people would come in just to see what we were doing. And because you had to keep up very high standards, not all of the jumpers made the cut. So we often had slight seconds, or definite seconds even, and people could buy them quite cheaply. One lot of visitors that we really enjoyed, and they were the harbingers of summer, were the diggers. Students from Bradford University who for several summers during the 1980s, undertook 2 archaeological digs in Sanday. And they used to come in on a Wednesday evening, and the sun doesn't always shine in Sanday, so sometimes they were glad to buy cheaply a nice woolly jumper. And sharp-eyed people among you might see sort of bottom second from the left is Steve Dockrell, who still comes back and forth to Orkney quite a bit. And he's always been a big burly chap, and you know, if there was a slight second jumper that was a second because it was far too big for people, we would say, that'll do for Steve. And he bought several, as did other people. And they came back year after year. And one year, Steve sort of shuffled in, slightly sheepishly, with a jumper under his arm, and handed it to Anita and said, I don't suppose you could do a retread on this, could you? It had no elbows, and all around the body was worn absolutely threadbare. Anita said, of course I can. And she took it away, knitted patches, grafted them in beautifully, did magic darning over all the thin bits, and he would have got a lot more years out of his jumper. They also bought bags of scrap wool, and the stripy jumper you see in the picture was knitted in a caravan in Sanday one summer. If anybody was not terribly sure about their knitting, they could come up to the wool hall with the half-knitted jumper, and somebody would be able to tell them what they needed to do next. So, right, it's Tom again.
Yeah, so this was one of the accolades that we got. We got many accolades in the press and so on, but in the 1980s, must have been 1985 or 1986, as you see behind me there, we won an award for outstanding contribution to the economy of the Highlands and Islands. It was, and you see on the other side of the screen, the article there, or parts of the article. It's just for companies within the Highlands and Islands area. So Elspeth and myself went down to Inverness, not Aberdeen, as misreported in the press there. I'm wearing a sweater. I don't know if it's a Sanday Knitters sweater or not, but it's not a thing that I would ever see myself ever going out in now. But that was what was chosen to wear for the picture for the Arcadian. But it was a great accolade to get that recognition for our success. And you'll probably see, because it should be in big enough print there, that in the 12 years growth, it said there, the income for Sanday Knitters went from 2,000 to about 120, 130,000. Certainly in the days when I was treasurer, I quite often could report to the AGM at the meetings that they would taken in about £100,000, which is pretty good in the 1980s. Moving on, I took the minutes as well, and you'll see there on the slide on the left an old science book. So yes, folks, stuff was recycled even in the 80s. And that must have come from the former teacher that was in my job. He obviously decided to recycle the book. You'll see there, though, in the open pages, my writing. Now, look at the writing now, and some of my other colleagues from the museum is actually sitting not far away. I don't write like that anymore, that's for sure. But I certainly produced the minutes for all the 12 years I was there. I just have a few excerpts here, which I won't bore you too much with, but just to highlight what basically was said. Chairman Neil Thompson, along with Mr. T. Rendall, told the board about the visit on the 15th January of Mr. A. Yakota. There you go, the fashion designer, and after examination of samples, they placed a provisional order of about 400 pieces, so it was very worthwhile. And then a lady called Sandra Towrie gave a full and very interesting report on her visit along with Mrs. Elephant to the International Knitwear exhibition in Paris in February. The total value of orders taken at that was about £7,000. Needless to say, I never got fancy trips. The only trip I made to Harrogate was to Harrogate, I think, and that's the only thing they paid me for. The day after I graduated with my first degree from the Open University. So anyway, and I was accompanied by Sandra. And I made it home. Anyway, some more extracts, so just very briefly, Barbara Sinclair was asked to present her report, and she said that trade affairs in Abbeymoor, which generated several £1,000s worth of orders. It was very important to go to these trade fairs. Well, HIDB, as Sandra mentioned, it did help us a lot, so it did more or less obliged to go to Abbeymoor. It was very worthwhile for years, and so was for Agent Wally and Thorpe as well. And then I followed a report, this was in minutes, at Sandra Towrie on her visit to the Royal College of Art in London as part of her scholarship, and she gave a very comprehensive account. She included by showing these presents some designs which might be included in the collection for autumn, and I think that they were. But just to let you see that, the last pretty bit there in the bottom, in November 1985, obviously in the winter, due to the fact that the time was approaching 11 p.m., it was decided that several items, including the production of a pattern, would be placed on the next agenda. The chairman then brought the meeting to a close. I think most of us, including the secretary-treasurer, was half asleep anyway. But it was time to go home. But there seemed to be a lot of discussion going on that particular night, but it was just getting too much to make proper decisions. The last extract, of course, was, and this is when you get the awe moment, this was my very last AGM on the 9th of May 1990. Tom Rendall then gave closing votes of thanks. He praised all the people who had worked hard throughout the year. But as this was his final AGM, Mr. Rendall gave a personal vote of thanks to the chairman, Mrs. A. Thompson, who had occupied the position as chair for all the 12 years of his years in office. He thanked Mrs. Sinclair, the managing director, for a good partnership. And this bit is very important, and gratefully acknowledged the advice given to him by the Board of Management on a variety of different subjects. Bear in mind, I was about to get married, and about the next 4 or 5 weeks, they were trying to give me some marriage guidance. It must have worked. I'm still with the same wife after 35 years. Anyway, but so thank you for that, Sandra, and others. And there is the excerpt. So I gave up the job 25th of May 1990, and there is, well, Lillian, my wife, then fiancée, and myself there along with Jim Wallace and, well, Paul Clough, and a guy called Howie Firth. Does anybody know Howie Firth? Howie, I think you were out, as you were a councillor for the Sandy and North Ronalds at the time, so Howie was there to open up the South Needgar, the new premises as well, and then Cecil Royfe is there as well. And in the front there is Elspeth Sinclair and Anita Thompson, who was my chair for all that years. So that was the day that I left the company, but also, of course, the day that the South Needgar became the base of the Sanday Knitters, and I'll hand you over to Sandra now to speak about that.
Yes, the company by that time had outgrown the old wool hall and would managed to buy new premises. And really, the business was getting bigger and bigger, and it started having to be run on a more business-like footing. Photography had come on, and we also had a new headmaster at the school, Rod Thorne, who was a keen photographer, and he used to capture various pupils. If we required a photo shoot, he would get some of the secondary pupils and take them to different places and take photographs of them inside jumpers. The girls there were just about 14 at the time, and had you been able to see their backs, there was a row of clothes pegs down the back of each one of them because the jumpers were far too big for them. One of the kind of unfortunate things about the move to the... Sorry. I'll keep going. One of the unfortunate things about the move to the new premises was that it was easier to work business hours.
I'll go backwards. My apologies.
And Elspeth, the manager, decided to use the premises as her base because it was actually warm. The old wool hall had been very cold and damp, and it really wasn't a pleasant place to work. But she moved towards working more like business hours. So knitters could come at any time that they wanted to hand in knitting and get some more wool. And at the same time, we opened a small gift shop, and which was very popular on the island, and it was important that people could come to the shop at whenever they needed to. The unfortunate thing was it started to lose the sort of social aspect that it had always had before. Wool Hall night had always been a great laugh, but things moved on. In the first half of the 1990s, we started to get a few bits of fame. Always at trade fairs, there would be journalists, and at some trade fair, someone who did feature writing for the Women's Weekly must have been there and liked what she saw. There we go. Because she came to Sanday and interviewed us for a feature in the magazine. And that was it. I reread it recently and thought, a bit of journalistic license there, but never mind. So this is what it looked like on publication day. Along with the article, they also invited us to do the knitting pattern for that week's edition. And so I designed the white jumper on the right there and wrote the pattern for it, and it was published in the magazine. At the same time, they agreed to do a knit pack, which was quite easy for the Women's Weekly because they just published a little cut-out coupon down in the corner of one page. And if you sent off a cheque for £25 with the coupon to Sanday Knitters, you would get in return a pack of wool, enough to knit the jumper, and a pattern. The photocopier was red hot because in total we sold almost 1,100 knit packs. I don't know how many jumpers actually got knitted from it, but that was the number of packs. And it made a tidy little profit for the company, and it didn't involve any knitting. Another bit of fame. This was a bit of a rush job. You will recognise Neil Morrissey and Martin Clunes of Men Behaving Badly fame. In December, well, it was Christmas, 1996, they did a Christmas special, which involved sort of flashbacks or imaginings of an ideal Christmas. And for an ideal Christmas, they needed Christmas jumpers. And they came to us, and I knitted the one that Neil Morrissey is wearing. And I spoke last year with the old woman, she was over 90 by then, who knitted Martin Clunes' jumper. She told me proudly, I knitted a jumper for Doc Martin once. So she was only slightly confused. But I'm conscious of time, so we need to move on to the final years. The company kind of came to an end for a variety of reasons. The going to trade fairs had largely stopped because a company that had been trading successfully for 25 years wasn't going to get a grant to pay to go to a trade fair. So if you went to a trade fair, you had to take an awful lot of orders to cover your expenses. So we relied more and more on our London agents, who were still getting us huge orders, in fact so huge that sometimes we were having real difficulty getting them knitted. And we had to go farther and farther away for knitters. In the beginning, everything was knitted in Orkney. Not Sanday, but around Orkney, people from the other islands knitted for us as well. But we had a group in Shetland, overseen by my mother, and as far south as Wolverhampton. So you can imagine that the overheads in getting those jumpers produced were crippling and really couldn't go on. Our agents were getting us orders largely from Japan at that time, and in the second half of the 1990s, the Far Eastern economy crashed and they couldn't afford our knitwear. So that market dried up. Also, some of the British market also dried up because they discovered that they could get similar, not nearly as good, but similar garments from China for a fraction of the price. So it started to be too expensive. Also, our knitters were starting to be, they knew how much the jumpers were selling for. So there was a need to pay them a sensible amount. It still wasn't very much. The other thing was that a lot of the people who were still running the company, volunteering their time, getting paid for some of it, they'd been there since the beginning, and they were well past retirement age by then. Nowadays, we talk about volunteer burnout. We hadn't heard of it in 1999, but that certainly was a feature. And I can remember that last board meeting. Things had been becoming tighter and tighter. And there was the evening that we sat down and decided, I forgot to move that on. We decided that it really was time to wind up the company, and that was a very hard decision, but it was taken with a degree of relief as well. And this is kind of the last picture. This was taken years earlier, but a lot of those women had been there from the beginning till the very end, and even although they were suffering from volunteer burnout, boy, did they roll up their sleeves and do what had to be done to finally wind up the company, which happened just about the end of last century. Right, Tom.
Yeah, and that is the group of ladies that I faced all that years ago in 1978, and most of them were still with us when I left in 1990, and is probably still there until 1999, when the company finally stopped trading. So what Sandra and I will do now for the next couple of minutes is looking at reflections and what did the Sanday Knitters do for us, apart from giving us some extra money. But it certainly gave me confidence in public speaking. I'm probably never shut up since, but I certainly would never have been able to stand up here at a science festival and do talks, and I'm doing it, as Howie knows, for a lot of years now. It gave me a chance to, well, the ladies must have given me some good advice, but then ladies are always good at speaking anyway. But, you hear the crowd. No, but on a more serious note, I developed an interest in working within the community. As Sandra said several times, and I probably said as well, this was a community effort. We wouldn't have paid a lot of money. A lot of it did for the good of the community and community life as well. not only in Sandy, but for all the North Isles. That's another, we had people in all the North Isles. How he's looking at his watch, that means we must try to give up. Basically, the opportunity to develop writing skills and summarize the main points. Well, I've done that a lot over the last few years with my academic work and still do. Realization of the importance of working the deadlines, which, I mean, you had to do when with the Sanday Knitters for obvious reasons, and just financial management skills and how to work within a budget. So for the last part of the lecture, I'll hand you over to Sandra.
My reflections from this, one of the things was the way I'd been brought up. You know, you were never praised lest you get too big-headed, and Lord forbid you ever blowed your own trumpet. So it was quite difficult for me, and I think it was going to the Royal College of Art that I actually began to realise that I did have some abilities that not everybody had. Not everybody could knit a jumper without a pattern and then write down what they'd done. So I think I started to value my own abilities a bit. Prioritising the most important thing when it's really busy. The travel that I did with Sanday Knitters, Paris, Munich, New York, all over Britain, gave me the confidence many years later to travel to South Africa and Malawi to volunteer in a teaching capacity, and gave me the brass neck to stand up in front of probably 100 Malawian teachers and dare to do in-service courses. It also landed me in my retirement occupation, which has been my involvement with Sanday Development Trust, on the strength of the fact that somebody remembered I had chaired Sanday Knitters. They put me forward as vice chair of the trust, and within about a month, I found myself in the chair, and I've been in and out of it quite a few times over the years. So, 25 years on since the company stopped. Well, I'm still knitting, those are my hands. And although we don't have a knitwear company in Sanday anymore, we do have a community craft hub, which is working extremely well. All the goods sold in the shop are made in Sanday. The Craft Hub can afford to pay probably living wage to a few people on a part-time basis, but the success of this enterprise is largely down to volunteers again. As well as selling items, it also teaches traditional skills. And it was through that that I got fingered again to teach knitting. An organisation called the North Isles Landscape Partnership were offering grants and supporting heritage projects in the North Isles. And I was asked if I would teach people to knit. And I said, yes, I will, but I want to make sure that Sanday Knitters is not forgotten, because more and more of the people who were there at the beginning are no longer with us. And Tom and I had said several times that we really need to write a book about this. So I got some funding, and that's what I did. So if you want to hear some more stories about Sanday Knitters, I think that Grace from the Arcadian Bookshop will be up there where you came in, and she'll have a little pile of books. If you haven't already bought one, you can buy one there, or it can be ordered online. So I think that's enough because we're out of time.
Now, Now, you see why we chose this as the Grimond Lecture, because it's exactly the kind of thing that, looking back in Orkney, when people spoke much, like the Grimonds, like the County Council, the Islands Council, everyone spoke so much about community development, and this is a classic example. And there's an opportunity, as Sandra says, to buy the book. And in fact, both Tom and Sandra will be there, so that would be a good chance to ask them questions. But what an opportunity to get a signed copy of the book, to take it away, to commemorate what has been a fascinating talk. I would like to ask you to join me in warm thanks to Tom and Sandra for a fascinating presentation.